The morning they locked my well was the morning I realized this was never about water. It was about control. And the strange thing is, if they had simply left me alone, nobody would have ever looked closely enough to discover what they were really doing. I remember walking outside just after sunrise with an old green watering can in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. It was one of those quiet mornings you move through almost on autopilot. The birds were making noise in the oak trees behind my property. The grass was still wet from dew, and I was already thinking about the fence repair I'd been putting off for weeks. Then I saw it. At first I thought someone had left a toolbox near my wellhead. But as I got closer, my stomach tightened. A brand new steel enclosure had been bolted directly over my well equipment. A heavy padlock hung from the front. Attached to it was a bright orange tag. And when compliant, do not tamper. I just stood there staring at it. For a few seconds my brain refused to process what I was looking at. Then the anger hit. This wasn't community property. This wasn't HOA property. This was my land. My well. My equipment. I'd owned this place for almost 16 years. Long before the fancy entrance signs went up. Long before the clubhouse. Long before people started moving here because some real estate brochure called the area a luxury country community. Back when I bought the property, it was mostly open land and a handful of homes spread across rolling fields. The well had been inspected, permitted, approved by the county, and maintained at my own expense ever since. Nobody from the neighborhood association had anything to do with it. Yet somehow I was standing there looking at a lock that somebody had installed without my permission. I walked around the enclosure twice, just trying to figure out who could possibly think this was legal. Then I noticed the small sticker on the side. Cedar Ridge Community Association. That was all I needed to see. I went inside and called the HOA office immediately. The receptionist transferred me to the property manager, a guy named Bryce Talbot. If you've ever met someone who sounds friendly while talking down to you at the same time, that's Bryce. The kind of guy who smiles while delivering bad news because he enjoys knowing he has power over someone. Mr. Walker, he said, dragging out every word like he was talking to a child. We've been attempting to contact homeowners regarding the community water transition. You locked my well, I said. You don't have the authority to touch my property. There was a brief pause, then a little chuckle. Actually, the board voted last month to require all residences to connect to the neighborhood water network. I don't live inside your utility district. You live within the community boundaries. That's not the same thing. Another pause. Then he said something I'll never forget. Sometimes cooperation is more important than technicalities. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Take the lock off my property. That's not going to happen. Then I'll remove it myself. His voice instantly changed. I wouldn't advise that. There could be consequences. The call ended right there. I wish I could tell you I had some brilliant response ready, but honestly, I just sat there staring at my phone wondering how somebody could become that arrogant. The thing is, Bryce hadn't always acted that way. When he first arrived 2 years earlier, he was polite, helpful even. Then the new HOA president got elected. Her name was Diane Mercer, and she had a vision for transforming Cedar Ridge into what she called a fully unified community. That phrase became her favorite slogan. Unified landscaping. Unified exterior colors. Unified parking rules. Unified amenities. Apparently unified water had become the next step. Most residents didn't pay much attention because they were already connected to municipal service anyway. But I wasn't. My well meant I paid virtually nothing for water beyond maintenance costs. No monthly utility bill. No service fees. No surprise rate increases. Looking back, I think that bothered them more than they wanted to admit. Around noon I drove over to talk with my nearest neighbor, Frank Delgado. Frank had lived there almost as long as I had, and possessed the rare ability to know everyone's business without appearing nosy. When I told him what happened, he frowned. You're not the first one. That got my attention immediately. What do you mean? Frank leaned against his truck and lowered his voice. A couple people got letters about mandatory connection fees last month. Most just paid because they didn't want the headache. Connection to what? He shrugged. Good question. That answer sat in the back of my mind all afternoon. Because the more I thought about it, the stranger the whole thing became. If there was really a legitimate community water system, where were the permits? Where were the public notices? Why was the HOA acting like a private utility company? That evening, just before dark, I found another notice shoved beneath my front door. This one was worse. Effective immediately, Daily fines would be assessed for maintaining an unauthorized private water source. I actually laughed when I read it. Then I stopped laughing, because whoever wrote that notice wasn't joking. And deep down, for the first time, I started to suspect that locking my well was only the beginning. The next morning proved I had underestimated just how far they were willing to go. I woke up before 6, walked into the kitchen half asleep, turned on the faucet, and got nothing but a hollow hiss of air. At first I thought maybe the pressure tank had finally given up. The equipment wasn't new, and after 16 years you learn to expect the occasional repair. But something felt off. I stepped outside with a flashlight and headed toward the pump shed. The steel enclosure was still locked over the wellhead, exactly where I'd seen it the day before. Then I noticed something else. The breaker box mounted on the exterior wall had been opened. One switch had been flipped off. I stood there for several seconds, just staring at it. Somebody hadn't simply threatened me. Somebody had physically entered my property and disabled my water supply. The anger came fast, but underneath the anger was something else, curiosity. Because people usually reveal their weaknesses when they get aggressive too quickly. If Bryce and the HOA board were this desperate to force me onto their system, then there had to be a reason. I turned the breaker back on, but the lock over the equipment prevented me from restarting the system properly. The message was clear. They wanted me frustrated enough to surrender. Instead, I drove straight to the county administration building. The records office sat inside an old brick structure that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. The air smelled like paper, dust, and old coffee. Most people would probably find the place boring. That morning it felt like a treasure map. I started with my own property records. Everything checked out exactly as expected. The well permit was valid. Inspection records were complete. Water quality reports were current. There wasn't a single issue. Then I started looking for permits connected to Cedar Ridge's so-called community water network. At first I assumed I was searching incorrectly because nothing appeared. No utility license. No water district authorization. No operating permit. No infrastructure registration. Nothing. I asked one of the clerks if there might be another filing category. She spent 20 minutes helping me search multiple databases. Same result. If they're operating a water system, she finally said, turning her monitor toward me. It isn't showing up here. That sentence stayed with me all day. It wasn't showing up here. A legitimate system should leave a paper trail. Permits. Engineering reviews. Environmental assessments. Compliance reports. Government agencies love paperwork. The complete absence of paperwork often means one thing. Somebody doesn't want questions asked. Before leaving, I requested copies of several documents connected to infrastructure easements in the area. Most of it was routine stuff, but one map caught my attention. A buried agricultural supply line crossed land west of the subdivision before continuing toward a commercial nursery about 3 miles away. I folded the map and took it home. That evening I spread everything across my dining room table. Maps, notes, property records, photocopies. It looked like the investigation board from a crime movie. Around 8 o'clock, Frank stopped by carrying a 6-pack. I showed him the documents. He studied them for a few minutes before pointing at the agricultural line. "You think they're using this?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Wouldn't that be illegal?" "Depends what they're doing." Frank laughed. "That's lawyer language. That's survival language." The truth was I was starting to see a pattern. Cedar Ridge had expanded rapidly over the previous few years. New homes meant new expenses. New expenses meant pressure on the HOA budget. Diane Mercer had promised improvements when she became president. Better landscaping, new amenities, expanded facilities. Residents loved hearing promises. Paying for promises was another matter entirely. If someone discovered a shortcut around permits, inspections, and construction costs, I could absolutely imagine the board convincing themselves it was acceptable. After Frank left, I decided to drive through the neighborhood. It was almost dark. Porch lights glowed along the streets. Families walked dogs. Kids rode bicycles. Everything looked normal. Yet once you start searching for something, you begin noticing details you missed before. Several freshly installed valve boxes sat along the roadside. Sections of disturbed soil cut across common areas. Near the clubhouse, I spotted a maintenance worker loading tools into a truck. I recognized him. His name was Todd. Nice guy, not exactly good at keeping secrets. I pulled over and started a casual conversation. We talked about weather, property maintenance, football. Then I casually mentioned the new water system. Todd immediately looked uncomfortable. Don't get me involved, he said. Involved in what? He shook his head. Nothing. Forget I said anything. That response told me more than a full confession ever could. The next morning I received another letter. This time the fine had increased. Apparently my refusal to connect now qualified as willful noncompliance. I called Bryce again. You're fining me for using a legal well. The board has adopted new community standards. Community standards don't override county law. Our attorneys disagree. Then your attorneys should read the law. I could practically hear him smiling through the phone. You'll understand eventually. That line bothered me for hours. Not because it was threatening, but because it sounded confident. Too confident. People bluff all the time. Bryce sounded like somebody who genuinely believed he couldn't lose. Which meant either he knew something I didn't, or he was so used to getting his way that reality no longer mattered. 2 days later, reality arrived unexpectedly. A woman named Evelyn Harper knocked on my door. I recognized her from HOA meetings, but barely knew her. She looked nervous. I heard about your well, she said. How? People talk. Fair point. She hesitated before continuing. My husband connected to the community water line last month. And the water tastes strange. That got my attention immediately. She explained that several neighbors had complained about odor, discoloration, and inconsistent pressure. Most assumed it was normal startup issues. One family started buying bottled water. Another installed expensive filtration equipment. None of them wanted to challenge the HOA because nobody wanted conflict. That's how organizations like this gain power. Not through authority, through exhaustion. People get tired, busy, distracted. They decide fighting isn't worth it. Then one day they realize they've surrendered things they never intended to give away. After Evelyn left, I called the State Water Authority. At first I expected to leave a message and wait weeks for a response. Instead, a compliance specialist answered directly. Her name was Monica Reyes. She listened patiently while I explained everything from the locked well to the mysterious community network. Occasionally, she interrupted with questions. Had equipment been installed on private property? Yes. Had access been granted? No. Was the system state licensed? Not that I could find. Then came the question that changed everything. Mr. Walker, did they physically secure your well equipment with a lock? Yes. Silence. A long silence. Finally, she spoke again. Can you send photographs? Of course. Please do that immediately. Her tone had changed. Professional before. Concerned now. I emailed everything within 15 minutes. An hour later, she called back. We're opening an investigation. I sat there stunned. That fast. Tampering with private water infrastructure is taken very seriously. So what happens now? Another pause. Honestly, if what you've documented is accurate, some people are about to have a very bad month. For the first time since this mess started, I felt something close to optimism. Not victory. Not yet. Just the realization that I wasn't crazy. The facts mattered. The law mattered. And somewhere beyond the arrogance of a neighborhood board and a property manager who thought he could bully anyone he wanted, there were still people whose job was to care about the truth. 2 weeks passed after that call. The HOA kept sending notices. The fines kept increasing. Bryce left 2 voicemails demanding compliance. I ignored all of them, because by then I was waiting for something else. And early on a Tuesday morning, while drinking coffee on my front porch, I finally saw it. 3 white state vehicles rolled slowly through the entrance of Cedar Ridge. Behind them came 2 utility trucks and a county inspection unit. They drove straight toward the clubhouse. I remember smiling into my coffee cup because suddenly I knew exactly why Monica had sounded so confident. The investigation wasn't coming. It had arrived. I wish I could tell you the HOA board saw those inspection trucks and immediately admitted everything. But people who spend too much time believing their own authority rarely surrender that easily. By the time I walked over toward the clubhouse, half the neighborhood was already gathering along the sidewalks. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone could tell it wasn't routine. State inspectors in reflective vests were unloading equipment, opening utility boxes, taking photographs, and speaking into radios. The atmosphere felt strange, almost like watching a storm roll in when the sky still looks clear. Then Diane Mercer arrived. Even from across the parking lot, I could see that practice smile she always used at community meetings. The smile that said everything was under control, even when it obviously wasn't. She approached one of the inspectors and started talking with animated hand gestures. A few minutes later, the inspector simply pointed toward a section of ground behind the clubhouse. Several workers immediately headed in that direction. That's when the mood changed. They weren't there to have a conversation. They were there because they already knew where to look. Over the next several hours, more residents came outside. Rumors spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. Some people thought there was a contamination issue. Others assumed the HOA had violated construction codes. The truth turned out to be worse. Around lunchtime, workers uncovered a buried junction connection hidden behind a fenced maintenance area. Even from a distance, I could tell the inspectors had found exactly what they were searching for. Phones came out. Neighbors started recording videos. Voices got louder. Questions started flying. Then one of the state officials posted temporary notices throughout the subdivision. I'll never forget watching people walk up to read them. The reactions were immediate. Confusion, anger, shock. The notice stated that the community water network was being suspended effective immediately, pending regulatory enforcement action. In plain English, the system wasn't authorized to operate. The very thing I had suspected from the beginning was now sitting on official government paper for everyone to see. Diane tried addressing residents near the clubhouse entrance. She spoke about misunderstandings, temporary solutions, administrative issues. Nobody seemed interested. People wanted answers. A father carrying bottled water demanded to know whether his family had been drinking from an unapproved source. An elderly couple asked why they had been charged connection fees. Another homeowner wanted to know why monthly assessments had increased. The questions kept coming. The answers never did. Meanwhile, inspectors continued moving through the neighborhood. Late that afternoon, one of their vehicles stopped in front of my property. Two officials stepped out and walked directly toward the steel enclosure covering my well equipment. One of them introduced himself, reviewed a few details, and then asked the question I'd been waiting weeks to hear. Would you like this removed? I almost laughed. More than you can imagine. A maintenance crew arrived less than 30 minutes later. Neighbors stood nearby watching as the bolts were loosened one by one. The metal cover that had started this entire mess finally came free. For a moment, nobody said anything. Then I walked over to the system, checked everything carefully, and restarted the equipment. A few seconds later, water surged through the line and poured from the hose onto the grass. It was such a simple thing. Just water. Yet after everything that had happened, the sound felt different. Cleaner somehow. Not because the water had changed, but because the intimidation attached to it was finally gone. Several people actually applauded. One of my neighbors laughed and said, "Looks like your well won." Maybe it did. But the bigger story wasn't about me. It was about what happens when people stop asking questions and start assuming authority equals legitimacy. Over the following weeks, the fallout grew larger than anyone expected. Regulatory penalties were issued. Legal claims started appearing. Residents demanded financial records. 3 board members resigned before the next community meeting. Bryce Talbot, the property manager who had once told me cooperation mattered more than technicalities, disappeared almost overnight. One day his office was occupied. The next day it was empty. Nobody seemed to know where he went. Or maybe they did and simply enjoyed not saying. As for Diane, she spent months insisting she had acted in the community's best interest. Maybe she believed that. Maybe that's the dangerous part. Some people convince themselves that good intentions excuse bad decisions. But intentions don't make something legal. Intentions don't give you permission to lock someone's property, cut off their water, or force them into a system they never agreed to join. Today, when I walk past that old well, I sometimes stop and think about how differently everything could have ended. If I had simply paid the fees, none of this would have surfaced. If I had accepted the fines, nobody would have investigated. If I had decided the fight wasn't worth the trouble, an entire neighborhood might still be operating under a scheme nobody bothered to question. Instead, all it took was one lock, one bad decision, and one group of people who became so confident they forgot the rules applied to them too. Every now and then, new neighbors hear the story and ask whether I feel like I got revenge. Honestly, revenge isn't the word I'd use. Revenge is emotional. What happened here was simpler than that. Someone crossed a line they never should have crossed, and eventually reality showed up with paperwork. But here's the question I still think about sometimes. If those inspectors had never arrived, if nobody had challenged the HOA, how many residents would have continued believing everything was perfectly normal? That's the part that stays with me. So let me ask you this. Was the board trying to improve the community and simply went too far? Or was this always about power and money from the very beginning? And if your HOA, neighborhood board, or local authority locked something on your property and told you it was for the good of the community, would you comply? Or would you start digging for the truth? Let me know in the comments, because after everything that happened in Cedar Hollow, I learned one lesson I'll never forget. The people who tell you not to ask questions are usually the ones most afraid of the answers.